Dr. Zollman, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure to speak to you. I thought I would start out and ask a question about one of your interests, which I know is poker playing. So, as a game theorist and someone who knows a lot about probability, how do you approach a poker game strategy, method that might be different from just sort of the average player?
Yeah, I mean, poker was actually what got me into game theory initially. I started playing poker and thought, oh, there must be a mathematical way to approach this. So I started thinking about it, and that's what led me to game theory and learning that there was a technique. So that's one of the things that's actually, if you read poker strategy guides, game theory makes appearances here and there, sometimes officially, sometimes not officially. But one of the things that you tend to focus on when you're studying it from a game theory or probability perspective is exactly that. Thinking about every decision that you're making according to what gets called expected value in poker, or us philosophers sometimes call it expected utility. The idea is to think about each decision not in terms of whether it's successful or unsuccessful, but whether it's the kind of thing, when repeated over the long run, would tend to give you more or less money. So, every time you come to a decision, you're sort of thinking about it from that more global perspective. And one thing that's helpful psychologically, actually, is that it sort of allows you to be okay with losing occasionally, because you recognize that, like, yeah, it's a game of chance. But if you're making the right plays, then over the long run, you can make money. One of the things I do, which I think a lot of other people don't, is tend to keep notes about things where I'm a little unsure about what to do, and then go back, and I'll sometimes use a computer or do some calculations to figure out what play I should have made in an attempt to figure out whether it was the right decision or not.
Do you prefer Texas Hold'em? Is that your game of choice?
Originally the game that I've always really loved is seven card stud high low, but it's very hard to find these days. That used to be the game that was the big game when I started playing, but Texas Hold'em has really taken over. It's probably the game I'm best at because I practiced the most, but it's not necessarily my favorite. If I had my druthers, I'd play that.
Okay. You mentioned making decisions, and I know that you're very familiar with decision theory within epistemology. And so maybe one of the questions that I have is zooming out a little bit on the field of epistemology as a whole. My sense of things is if someone is just sort of beginning to get into the field of epistemology, maybe they get into it through Descartes or skepticism, maybe
Mm-hmm.
Kant. Maybe they understand some Gettier cases and thinking about what is this thing called knowledge and how do we sort of successfully have knowledge. But at least my impression is that the field of epistemology has in some ways kind of advanced into formal epistemology,
Mm-hmm.
decision theory. I guess game theory is sort of in the mix there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Can you help us get a sense of the field of epistemology as a whole, and then how your work in those different fields has contributed to the field as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so epistemology is this huge field. The study of knowledge can encompass an enormous amount of different things. And although it feels very philosophical and oftentimes self-contained in philosophy, it also connects to a lot of other disciplines because statistics is a way that we have of learning about the world. And so if we want to understand knowledge, at least some parts of it, we need to understand how statistics works. And the same thing with decision theory and game theory and all of these different things. So oftentimes I like to think about epistemology a little bit more broadly than your average philosopher does. It is about skepticism, of course, and it is about Gettier, but it's also about a huge number of other questions that connect with other disciplines and maybe have been completely spun off into other disciplines. One of the things, there are kind of two major divisions that I sort of organize epistemology in my head. One is the difference between whether or not you think of belief and knowledge as fundamentally what sometimes gets called qualitative or dichotomous notion. That is, are we interested in belief versus non-belief or knowledge versus non-knowledge? Or, on the other hand, do we think about it as a kind of continuous quantity, something like degree of belief or strength of belief or strength of knowledge? And when you start to think about things in terms of degree of belief or strength of belief, now that's when you start to edge into the mathematics, because now what you might ask, well, how strongly? And so that feels very naturally like a quantitative or numerical measure, and a lot of people use probability for that. You don't have to. Some people want to use other things, but that's one division. So the division between sort of, is it dichotomous or qualitative on the one hand, or on the other hand, is it something like a matter of degree or quantitative on the other? And then the other division that I think about is the individual versus social. So individual epistemology is the classic thing that you get from Descartes, right? So Descartes says, let me sit and literally pull the blanket over my head and dispense of all knowledge that I got from other people, and let me just think about it by myself. Whereas a social epistemology specifically thinks of the way we get our knowledge as through other people. So other people can contribute to our knowledge by telling us things, or by giving us evidence, or by assisting us in learning about the world. And so if you kind of see that division, that kind of gives you four quadrants, so to speak, of the different types of epistemology. And I think of myself in the social epistemology that also thinks of belief in quantitative terms. So I'm kind of in that square. Sometimes gets called formal social epistemology. And so as a result, I end up interacting with both social epistemologists, but who don't use mathematics as much, and also individual epistemologists who do use mathematics. So that's why I kind of sometimes can seem a little bit all over the place in philosophy, because I'm sort of live in this one quadrant where I'm certainly not the only person there, but it makes me a little unusual in that there isn't a huge number of people there, although it's been growing a lot in recent years. So that's been aside.
That's helpful. When I was a grad student, and I don't know how common this experience is, but when I started having to take philosophy very seriously, it was, let's say, surprising to me how much mathematical knowledge, how many mathematical concepts, and even technical skills were needed to get into some fields. For someone who really isn't aware of how much mathematics can, let's say, infiltrate or even just be related to the field of philosophy, in your perspective, how is mathematics helpful in philosophy? How are those two things related? Because initially, I think a lot of people would say those seem like two completely different things.
Yeah, no, I always have to explain this. I'll say, well, I'm a mathematical philosopher, and I've talked to somebody who doesn't know philosophy, especially, and they're like, that seems like, math and philosophy seem like they're supposed to be at the opposite ends. But, it's interesting because I really feel like that's actually quite a modern way of thinking about philosophy. Because, if you think Leibniz was a very famous philosopher and also invented calculus, and Descartes actually, although we've dispensed with a lot of the mathematics that he invented, still there's the Cartesian coordinate system, which was invented by Descartes. So this idea that there should be this distinction, with philosophy on the one hand and math on the other is historically actually quite new. And the way they fit together is in a couple of different ways. One way is, of course, anytime you want to study science is done with numbers and with mathematics. And so anybody who wants to study science, whether that's an epistemologist or a philosopher of science or somebody who does ethics of scientific research, they have to understand at least something about the math, because you can't understand modern science without understanding statistics, without understanding the theoretical mathematical tools that get used in various sciences. And then the second way that it fits in is the thing that mathematics has always given us is a kind of rigorous way of approaching problems. It prevents a certain kind of equivocation, and it forces a kind of exactness, which philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, have always prized. And that's why logic has for a long time always been a part of philosophy. It's only more recently that other mathematical tools have sort of made it back into philosophy. But the desire for that exactness, it goes a long way back. Hobbes, when he wrote the Leviathan, said that he was trying to model himself after Euclid's Elements and the exactness that he found in Euclid. And so this idea that, philosophy that we oftentimes think of as not particularly exact might strive for the exactness of mathematics is I think, actually a really old idea. And so by using mathematics, we hope that we can achieve that exactness, so that it can help rigidify our understanding a little bit more, in order to make sure that we're not making mistakes or equivocations that would fly under the radar if we didn't have a more formal methodology.
So related to that, if you're willing, I'm wondering if you could talk about your own personal biography, having grown up under two professors at Kansas State. Was it just inevitable that you would maybe be a professor, number one, but also be involved in some way in the sciences. Can you talk a little bit about your exposure to that at, growing up, and how that led into where you've become?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's one of those things where, to answer your question directly, it probably was inevitable, although at the time it didn't feel that way at all. So my story is a bit of a strange one. So both my parents are professors. My father was in physics, my mother in science education, although she also had a physics background. And so as a result, I math and science was just the lingua franca of my childhood. They wrote a physics textbook when I was 0 to 5 years old, and my mother tells the story of she would proofread out loud to me, in order to proofread the textbook. But that's how I learned to talk, was listening to a physics textbook. So it sort of feels like I should have realized that it was going to be inevitable. But actually, when I went to college, I had done I had done debate in high school and then was doing intercollegiate debate in college. And so I went to Kansas State because I was recruited by their debate team. I didn't go for philosophy. And I was interested in philosophy, but I had really become interested in what now seems, the opposite of what I do. I was really interested in what's called continental philosophy. So, Derrida and Foucault and these sorts of people, which is very non-mathematical, very much the opposite side. But the department at Kansas State was a very scientifically and mathematically oriented philosophy department. And the thing was, when I got to see that kind of philosophy, which I had never seen before, I think that said, oh, that grabbed to the philosophical part of me, but it also grabbed the part of me that had been latent maybe for a little while, the more mathematically oriented side. And so I really fell in love with that philosophy of science in particular, and also decision theory and game theory. And so then, as I got to the end of my time as an undergraduate, several of my faculty there really encouraged me to look at some of the more specialized programs in philosophy of science, including at the time what was a brand new program at UC Irvine, which is where I ended up going.
And so there are so many questions that I could ask, but one would be, were there, besides just the approach, I mean, I think you stated it well, there was sort of this marriage of the philosophical interest more generally, but also the methodology under analytic philosophy. Were there particular topics or things that were sort of applicable that grabbed you even more than that? Or how did that sort of come about? And then also, how did that grab you so much that you wanted to do graduate work and a PhD?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I just loved philosophy in general. So I certainly found some topics more interesting than others. But when I was an undergraduate, I was just interested in formal philosophy of any kind. Like, I liked logic, I liked probability, I liked game theory, I liked all of these different things. And so at that time, I didn't really have a focus. I applied to a lot of different programs just thinking, I want to do something that employs more mathematical tools in philosophy, because it really was a marriage of those two things. I really like thinking very deeply, thinking about very general problems, which are abstract and difficult to answer, but I also like the exactness of the mathematical tools. And so it wasn't really until graduate school that I sort of narrowed down a little bit. And when I went to UC Irvine, I went there knowing that they were very strong in game theory, but they were also strong in other things like logic and philosophy of science, philosophy of physics. And so I thought, oh, this is great. Like, I'll have a lot of opportunities to do different things. But I was starting to get interested in game theory specifically. And what initially grabbed me about game theory was poker. I started as a poker player and then used it, and then started reading the work of Brian Skirms, who eventually became my dissertation supervisor, and saw how game theory was being employed to answer questions in things like political philosophy and ethics and philosophy of language. And that was a moment where I was like, oh, this is really exciting, because it's brand new. It's a new mathematical tool that hadn't been used very much in philosophy. And that excited me. And working with Brian was great. He was very giving with his time, one of these faculty that's just wonderful to work with as a graduate student, because he was eager to get me involved from jump in that research agenda. And so it just clicked right away. And so that's why I did it. But it's one of those things where I love what I do, but I'll bet if I had went somewhere else, I would have loved what I did then too, because I just love the marriage of those two things together.
Did you have philosophical heroes then, people who you were reading and just going, okay, this is sort of an exemplar that I can look up to, maybe besides your supervisor?
Yeah, there were a couple of people that I always really respected for a variety of different reasons. One of the people that really motivated me, and my dissertation was really motivated by, was Philip Kitcher. So he wrote this book called The Advancement of Science. It was published in the 90s. And the last chapter of that, he actually used game theory tools to ask questions about the social epistemology of science. And so that was something where I was like, oh, this is great. Like, I like game theory. I also like philosophy of science. So this marriage seems to me to be really exciting. And that way of approaching things, I really got interested in. So that was one person. On the other hand, although she's a very different type of philosopher, Penelope Maddy, who is also a faculty member at UC Irvine, was really influential to me because again, she's mathematically oriented. She does philosophy of math, but her methodology herself is a bit more traditionally philosophical. But she was still very exacting, very precise, and I took a bunch of classes from her and really enjoyed her writing. And so she was another person who I have always had an enormous amount of respect for, not because she and I worked on the same topic, because I didn't really go into those topics, but just because of her approach to mathematical issues as a way of being a philosopher of math and thinking about the way math worked. I found really, really impressive. Now, that said, absolutely everybody that I worked with at UC Irvine was great. I worked a lot with Kyle Stanford and Jeff Barrett, who were both great and really very involved in my philosophical education. But also just everyone else there had a hand in one way or another in my development. So I was just incredibly lucky to do a PhD there, because there were so many good people and that were very giving with their time, that they've got a mark on me in one way or another in terms of how I develop.
So in your development of game theory, in your academic work, I know you all also teach on this subject.
Mm-hmm.
So those are pretty different levels. If you're teaching undergraduate courses and you're doing academic work, right, you have to really pitch it in different ways, obviously. How did you cultivate the best approach or pitch at an undergraduate level of what game theory is? How are you motivating students to care about this sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in one respect. I'm at Carnegie Mellon University, so a lot of our students are very technically oriented. Even our philosophy majors are oftentimes dual philosophy and computer science or something like that. So actually, a lot of our students come in intrinsically interested in mathematics. But in general, I always think it's really important in mathematics, anytime you're teaching mathematics, but especially with philosophy, to emphasize what is the point of what you're doing, what's the important parts of what you're doing. So I think it's very easy in mathematics education to get into the details and lose track of why is this thing we're doing? Why are we trying to prove this theorem rather than that? Or why are we defining this mathematical operation in this way rather than a different way, or something like that. So one thing I always try to do when designing my undergraduate classes is start with a big picture problem that we're not going to necessarily answer entirely. But when I teach, for instance, a decision theory class, the first day I just sit down and say, all right, let's come up with examples where we would call somebody irrational. Like, just think about when have you heard that phrase? Either somebody called you irrational, you called somebody else irrational, or whatever. Let's just write a bunch on the board. And then I start to sort of say, like, okay, now we want to have a sense for, we use this word all the time, but it means a bunch of different things. And I sort of, can subdivide the different ways that people talk about it into kind of different categories. And I said, now we want to come up with a theory that makes sense of all of this. And, we start talking through it. And I always use a couple of examples. Like, people will say, people who go to a casino and gamble are irrational. What does that mean? Right? What would it mean to say? Or almost always, no matter what your religious bent is, somebody will call you irrational for believing in God, or irrational for not believing in God, or something like that. Okay, what does that mean? And so we talk through those examples, and then as we go along in the course, even though it becomes very mathematical, I always try to return back to, okay, now that we've done a bunch of mathematics, what does this mathematics do to answer that original question? And I think that constantly doing that kind of, take a step forward, take a step back is really important, because at the end of the day, my students aren't going to probably remember all of the mathematical details that we went through. But my hope is that they have a sense for the method that's being used and appreciation for how it might be useful in answering questions like that.
I think that's so helpful. It sounds like it's a pedagogical approach that, let's say, isn't shared by all philosophers.
Yeah.
And to me, part of the motivation for even doing a podcast like this and just my sort of mission as a whole aligns so much with that. But and it sounds, I mean, I want to get into your popular writing as well, but it sounds like that fits with your overall picture of what a philosopher should be, or a bigger picture. Can you talk a little bit about like what your, not mission is, but overall purpose, your pedagogical approach in the classroom, but also as it extends beyond the classroom?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really motivates me is that I think that philosophy is so relevant to everything. It's got a finger in any problem that we're dealing with, whether it's from a political problem or a scientific problem or an ethical problem or whatever. Philosophy is always there. And what grabbed me about philosophy, even back in the days, when I first got into it, was I saw those connections right away. I was like, oh my God, the answer to this applies to all of these different things. But the way that we've presented philosophy to the world, both in terms of introduction to philosophy, but also in terms of the way it gets presented in popular culture, oftentimes is exactly the opposite. It's presented in a way that feels very disconnected from our students' lives or from people's lives. It's a way that seems very abstract, and oftentimes the way we pitch it is as focused on very classic problems like skepticism and questions about like political legitimacy and these sorts of things, which are interesting problems, but not really the problems that are animating our students. When the American Revolution is happening, questions of political legitimacy are the questions of the day, but they're not exactly the questions of the day anymore. They're related for sure, and I 100% see the connection. But when you start there, the students won't see it, and oftentimes they'll turn you off. Or especially if you're trying to get to a popular audience, like students at least have to stay in class to get the A, right? But the popular audience can put your book back on the shelf. And so I think that it's really important to try and emphasize the way that philosophy is connected to so many different things and is relevant to so many different things. And so what's animated my both classroom teaching and also my desire to connect with popular audiences in the way that I try and do it is by starting with something that people take as relevant and then showing how that's connected to a deep philosophical problem rather than the other way around, which I sometimes think just loses.
I didn't anticipate asking this, but you mentioned a casino, and we're seeing a whole lot of sports betting. That industry has gone crazy. How do you, as someone who can sort of apply your work, how do you see this rise in sports betting? Is there any application from your work to this rise in sports betting?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, first off, sports betting is exactly a classic decision theory problem. I mean, we use it all the time in examples in class because you have some initial belief about how likely it is you think a team is going to win. You're being offered some kind of odds that you'll win a certain amount of money if they win and lose a different amount of money if they lose. And so calculating whether or not that makes sense in terms of your expected monetary return is right away a straightforward decision theory problem. It's not easy, of course, but it's a straightforward one. I think the more interesting question, one of the things I emphasize to my students, is the question about like, is sports betting rational or is going to the casino rational? There are oftentimes I think oftentimes people of a more like left-wing bent all think, oh, it's irrational to go to the casino, it's irrational to bet on sports. But then they make a weird confusion for people of that political bent because they say, oh, you can't expect to win money in the long run from the casino, or you can't expect to win money in the long run from sports betting. But of course, people might care about lots of things other than money. I mean, I can't possibly win money by going to the movies either, but nonetheless I go, right? Because I find the experience of going to the movies worth the amount of money that I would lose. And so I think that's the more deep and interesting question, which is if somebody's, say asking me, should they bet on sports? I'd say, well, look, chances are that you'll lose money in the long run doing it. And so the question is, does the enjoyment that you get from engaging in that practice, does that make sense? Are you willing to pay that amount of money? Now, sports betting is complicated because you can, in theory, make money in the long run. The public as a whole will lose money, but individual sports bettors can make money. And then the question is much more one of, if you think that you're the kind of person who's going to make money, what do you know why are you better at this than average? Because average will be a loser, right? The casino exists for a reason. They're making money. So the question, if somebody comes to me and says, oh, but I'm sure I'm going to make money at betting on sports, I'm going to say, okay, convince me that you're better than average. And by framing it in that way, it's oftentimes, I think it's very revealing, because then people will be like, well, I'm better than your average person at predicting sports. I'm like, yeah, but the average person isn't betting on sports. Why are you better than the average person who bets on sports? Because, I don't know a ton about sports. I'm sure that lots of sports bettors are better than me, but I'm also not betting on sports. So, framing the question in that way. Same thing with the market too, right? Somebody says, oh, I've got this brilliant strategy. It's going to make a ton of money in the stock market. It's like, why are you better than the average person who's trading on the stock market? And framing it in that way, I think, is the question. Now, there's nothing wrong with losing money at sports betting if you go in knowing that that's what you're doing. So I'm not going to tell somebody not to do it. But I do think it's important that people recognize that, just because you know a little bit more than sports than the average person, that average person as a whole doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be better than the average sports player.
I think that's so helpful. It's a great application. In your work, you cover so many other disciplines besides philosophy. You are involved in political theory. You're involved in economics. You're involved in, as you mentioned, the sciences, particularly biology and psychology. What have you learned about the appeal of philosophy to those other disciplines? I assume you're interacting with a whole lot of other majors, not just in your philosophy classes, but those classes that sort of intersect with other disciplines. Mm-hmm. What are some of the takeaways that you have learned from those courses?
My experience in general is that most people actually really like philosophy once they see that it's relevant to them. And it's most of the people who think they don't like philosophy have encountered a part that isn't relevant to them, and so they don't like that part, or they just don't even know what it is. And it's really, really shocking to me. Like when interacting with other academics or with students from other disciplines, it's almost always they come in with this attitude of like, philosophy, this is stupid. It's not going to have anything relevant to say to me. And then I start talking to them about what they're doing, and I start, thinking about where the philosophical connections are. And then I find one, and then they're like, oh, that's super interesting. But that's not philosophy, is it? And you say, well, actually, it is. And here's some philosophers that have worked on it. And so my experience is that I think people are way more philosophical than they realize. But because of the way that philosophy has been presented to them, they think, well, I don't care about this handful of problems that are the classic philosophy problems, and so therefore I don't like philosophy. Or I once learned this one bit of philosophy that is definitely not relevant to me, and I didn't like it, and so therefore I must not like all of philosophy. And when I was writing my popular book, my co-author is a science journalist, spent a whole career as a science journalist. And he was like, we started working together, and he said to me, he's like, I didn't know philosophy did any of these things. He had a college degree, had taken philosophy classes in undergraduate, but it was your classic intro to philosophy. And so he didn't know anything that was going on in contemporary philosophy of science. And he really expressed some remorse. He's like, man, if I had known more about this, like I would have been writing about it, in popular science journalism for decades. But he just didn't know it was there. And that's not his fault. It's our fault because, how should he have even known to look for it? Because nothing in his education said that even existed.
I want to get to the book that you mentioned. Before we get to the book, I do want to follow up a little bit on what you just said. So why do you think philosophers, or maybe I can sort of abstract it, the field of philosophy is so, is the field of philosophy so unique in how bad it is at marketing itself?
Yeah, we're terrible.
Do I have that right? Or how do you approach that sort of thing? Why do so many people have that initial impression of sort of, I don't think so, this is not for me? What accounts for that in your mind?
I think it's a bunch of different things. I mean, I think one thing is we're bad at marketing. We've never had to market ourselves, right? We're the oldest academic field. So, we've never had to sell ourselves in the way that like other fields have had to say, here's why we should exist. Philosophy has existed for thousands of years, so why we've never had to do that. I also think part of it is just I think it's great that we know our own history and that we think about our own history. And I think that a lot of other fields suffer from repeating the same mistakes over and over again because they don't know our own history. But I sometimes think that we overemphasize our own history. So I think it's so common for philosophers to think to themselves like, oh, here's an interesting contemporary problem. But in order to understand that, we got to go 2,000 years back to its beginning and walk all the way through the history of philosophy to talk about the contemporary problem. And that's good for us. That's good for us to know. That's good business practice for philosophers to know, that to make sure we're not repeating the same mistake. But when we're talking to somebody else, they may not care to go on that 2,000-year journey with us. And so we need to sometimes say, like, we don't need to go back to Plato and explain to them how it's connected. Not because that's not interesting. I mean, I like that too, but because that's not the way that you're going to grab somebody. Unless they already are intrinsically interested in the history of the topic. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that we see those deep historical connections, and we want to show somebody where they are. But if that's not what they're interested in, then they're not going to like it. And so mathematicians, I think, suffer from the same problem sometimes. It's like you go to a mathematician, you ask a mathematical question, they say, oh, well, in order to answer that, first I have to explain to you, like, point set topology or something like that. And it's like, yeah, if somebody loves math, they want to do that. But if they don't love math, they maybe don't want that whole story. And so I think that's probably why we're bad. And so why we're bad at kind of grabbing people is because we sort of lose track of, not everybody cares about the field in the way that we do. And so remembering that they may be asking us a question for a very particular purpose that we can help answer, but that we can also ruin by giving them too much information.
It does seem like there is almost this expected trope of the eccentric philosopher, like the eccentric mathematician, like maybe the eccentric scientist, and maybe, people fall into sort of a stereotype because it's easy. I don't know, but that might be a part of it.
I think that's true. And, there's just very little. I mean, when you're an academic, you're so insulated from consequences of these things. It's not, if you're boring, it doesn't really hurt you that much.
No, that's right. I mean, I have a lot of views on, I think that's right in terms of research. In the classroom, it's sort of a different story, but then that, we could talk a lot about the ratio of classroom work and priority versus research, and that's a whole other can of worms. But maybe somewhat related, I do want to ask you, so you're doing this academic work. When did the desire or motivation to take these ideas to a popular level emerge? Because, and I've talked to many other philosophers about this, you have to devote a lot of time and, in a lot of senses, a different skill set to do that kind of work. So how did that desire emerge that you were going to commit more time and work to something that may help you professionally, but I don't think in every case is a given?
Yeah, and I was very motivated by what I just mentioned to you, that it really bothered me the degree to which scientists that I would interact with, especially, didn't know anything about philosophy of science. And initially I started out getting mad at them. It's like, how dare you not know more? But then I started to realize, like, I mean, it's kind of our fault that we're not doing a good job. And so I had always had this desire to try and make philosophy that was connected to other people, and that and to broaden the perspective of philosophy. So I was always really interested in the idea of writing for popular audiences, writing these sort of, books for educated audience, but not necessarily for philosophers or for even necessarily people in the academy. The particular book that I did, The Game Theorist Guide to Parenting, it was a very weird way in, and it was definitely, that wasn't if I had to predict or choose the way in, that wouldn't have been it, because it sort of fell in my lap through a long series of accidents. But nonetheless, when the opportunity arose, I was very eager to do it, and so I wanted to do it right away. And I was very lucky because my co-author, Paul Raeburn, and my editor, Amanda Moon, were tremendous. Paul was a long-term science writer, was very good, was very quick to pick up the science, but also very good in finding ways to translate it for popular audiences, and he taught me a ton. And Amanda, our editor, was also great. And in fact, she gave us incredible good feedback, the feedback you want, not too much, but really the critical feedback. And both of them really helped me to shape my writing for popular audiences in a way that I think I wouldn't have been able to do alone. So although it wasn't like the plan or something that I had initially thought of doing, I couldn't have imagined a better way to start doing that, because it really was a graduate level education in that on the job, so to speak.
So how did that project even come about? Who was the person who pitched it, and what was the sort of start of all that?
Yeah, so it's a weird story. So the very beginning of this actually started with a person from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which is one of our local papers here in Pittsburgh, wrote me an email. He had just graduated college, took a game theory course as an undergraduate, and said that he loved that course. He thought it was super applicable to all sorts of like everyday things. And he wanted to do Dear Abby, but with game theory, basically. So somebody writing in with like super simple questions, and then a game theorist would answer that. And so he asked me if I would be willing to do it. I guess he found me on the web somehow. And I was like, oh, sure, that sounds like fun. It was just going to be one time, run on a Sunday, that sort of thing. And so he went around the office and collected a bunch of questions and then sent them to me, and I picked out some and wrote answers to them, and they published it. It was fun, and it was just a one-off. Nothing really substantial came of it. And then about a year later, I want to say, it was quite a while, I got an email from a freelance journalist who was working on parenting. She was sort of developing a brand in parenting. Jennifer Brenamy Wallace, I think was her name. And she had seen that thing in our local paper and thought maybe this would be applicable to parenting. And so she interviewed me. I talked with her. She bounced some ideas off of me. I gave her some quotes, and she ended up running a short piece in the Wall Street Journal, I'm pretty sure, on like a Sunday also. And then it was maybe like 2 or 3 days later, Amanda Moon, who was at that time the head editor for the Scientific American book imprint at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, sent me an email and was like, I thought this was great. I thought that was a book. I emailed Jennifer. She passed. She didn't think it was for her, but she said you were great and that I should talk to you. And I said to Amanda, I was like, this sounds great. Like I love the idea. It's something I've been wanting to do. I think it works, but I've got 2 problems. I've never written for popular audiences before, except for that one thing. And more seriously, I don't have any kids. So how am I going to write a book on parenting? And she said, oh, I've got a solution. I just finished editing Paul Raeburn's last book, which was called Do Fathers Matter, which was about this. What does science say about the importance of fathers in their children's lives? And it's just been published. So he's a popular science writer. He's a parent. He's written on the science of parenting. So he'd be great. Why don't we put the 2 of you together and see if you hit it off? And so we had a couple of meetings and it went great. And so we went off with it. But yeah, it was not my idea. It 100% fell in my lap. And I'm so grateful that it did, and lucky that nobody else wanted to grab the ball and run with it, because I had such a great time writing it with Paul and Amanda.
How did you balance that work with your academic work? And I guess I should ask, did you have tenure at that point, or like what was that stage? Okay, so
that was definitely important. Like I think it would have been harder to say yes to if I had not yet had tenure, because I mean, my colleagues were supportive, but it doesn't fit within the standard way that your job is evaluated in academia. I mean, literally, we don't, on our yearly evaluations, we don't have a box for popular writing. And so I think it's a problem, and I think it's something universities should reevaluate, and something I've complained about here. But because I had tenure, I had a little bit of freedom. I actually found it did trade off with my academic work for sure. But I actually enjoyed it. It was writing that was a little easier because it was more colloquial. It was a little bit more, it was a little bit less demanding intellectually in a certain sense. So I actually found it easier to write than I was expecting. It still took a long time, and the time, popular books, the time is really compressed. So from start to finish was less than a year on that book. And so it was a lot of writing, but I found it not too terribly demanding. Now, that said, Paul and Amanda were a great help. Like if it weren't for them, I don't know that it could have ever gotten off the ground, because they really were also very much involved in the project.
That's fascinating. I can't say that I would have expected that it would be. I think that does make sense that it was easier in one sense, but translating these very high concepts, you're in the clouds here with the game theory, and you're not able to use all the terminology that you might employ either in the classroom or especially in academia. And so I can imagine challenges for that. But yes, I mean, other people helping you, that does make sense. But that seems like a pretty big challenge, is to do that translation work from academia to popular level.
It was, and it's a challenge. But one thing that Amanda emphasized to me that was helpful is I was actually, I think, initially more prone to sort of make it too simple, go too far in the other direction. And I also thought about it too much like a philosopher was like, here's the thing I'm trying to communicate only that thing, get rid of all the extra stuff. And one of the things that Amanda really emphasized to me is like, you can include lots of other anecdotes, things that, for in an academic book or an academic article, you wouldn't include, like this funny story about David Hume, you can't put in your paper on like Hume's theory of miracles or something like that because it's not relevant. But when you're writing these books, people want to learn things, but they don't necessarily, it's not like you need to be hyper focused on this is the thing I'm trying to teach you. And so she really emphasized like including funny stories, anecdotes, give a little bit of technical terminology, help people to learn it. Like these are actually things that they want to do. And so I kind of had gone too far in one direction and she sort of pulled me back. But as a result, it gives you a little bit more freedom because you get to include all sorts of like, there's that funny story that you once learned about John von Neumann or whatever that you could throw in there. And so in some ways, for me, I like telling stories anyway. So it sort of fit with the way that I wished I could write sometimes, but can't because of academic standards.
There is, I want to get to the parenting side, but there's a funny story about rock, paper, scissors. So how does a game theorist analyze or even approach rock, paper, scissors?
Oh, it's a huge example. I once joked, I taught a graduate level class on evolutionary game theory. And on the first day I said, basically this whole class is about rock, paper, scissors. And it's like, that's not quite true, but it's more true than probably I should admit. Rock, paper, scissors is an interesting game because if you think about it from like an optimal standpoint, what's the optimal thing to do in rock, paper, scissors? Everything depends on what you think the other person is going to do, right? If they're like Bart Simpson and is going to play rock no matter what, then the best thing for you to do is play paper no matter what. So it's a very complicated, interactive reasoning process where I have to think about what you're going to do. But of course, you're thinking about what I'm going to do. So I have to think about what you think, I think, and you can see how it goes. The classic answer is you should randomize. You should just choose one of the three options at random. The reason that's good is that if you can outthink me, then you can't beat me. Right? If I'm choosing at random, there's nothing you can do to beat me. Whereas if you can outthink me and I do something else, then if you can always stay a step ahead of me, you can always beat me. However, the thing that's more complicated is that can't be beat, but it's also not. It's not going to beat someone else either because it's going to win on average against everything 1/3 of the time. And so part of the thing that makes it really complicated is this question of, do you think that you can outsmart your opponent? Do you think you can stay one level above them or stay one step ahead of them or not? Because if you think you can, then you might want to try and outthink them. But if you think you can't or you're afraid that you can't, then you can retreat to what's called the minimax strategy. That's the 1/3 probability across the three options, choosing at random. And so that's the kind of thing where you can think about it in two different ways from a game theory perspective, and depending on how you're thinking about it, you come to very, very different conclusions. One funny story about rock, paper, scissors is it's used in biology a lot, which sounds crazy, but there are actually interesting examples of both plants, bacteria, and animals that have evolutionarily similarly structured things where there are three different strategies that like a bacteria can use, and the rock strategy beats the paper strategy, and the paper strategy beats, the paper strategy beats the rock strategy beats the scissors strategy, and scissors beats the paper strategy. And so part of the reason it gets analyzed a lot in what's called evolutionary game theory is because it turns out to be applicable to some very interesting biological systems. And so it's more than just like a simple children's game that we can use as an example.
That's fascinating. On the parenting side, one of the first and I think most applicable, kind of coolest examples is a concept, I cut, you pick, from game theory. And the way that you and your co-author apply that, I think is really cool. Can you explain how that concept came from game theory and how you apply it to parenting in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of those things where it's like we've all probably heard of it in the context of like dividing a cookie between two kids or something like that. The idea here is basically you have a single good that can be divided into parts. So like a piece of cake or a cookie or classic examples. And you want to divide it in a way that both people will feel is fair. But especially if you don't know something about them, you don't necessarily know what counts as fair. Like if the cookie has, or cake is a better example. If the cake has part chocolate, part vanilla, maybe one person likes chocolate more, maybe the other person likes vanilla more, or something like that. So the way that you set it up is you ask one person to cut it into two pieces, and then you let the other person choose which of the two pieces they want. So that's the I cut, you pick. Parents know this for cake and cookies and things like that, and it gets used a lot. But it actually turns out to be a very generic strategy. You can cut lots of things in various ways. So, for instance, if you have a big pile of toys and the kids are arguing over who gets to play with what toy, you can have one child divide all the toys into two piles, cutting the big pile of toys into two piles, and then the other child chooses which one they're going to play with. Or you can do it with time. So you can say something like, well, if, two kids both want their parents' attention, you can say, okay, I've got 3 hours. One of you decide who, divide that 3 hours into two portions of time, and then the other child gets to decide, do they want the first hour or the second 2 hours or something like that. So it's the thing that's interesting about it is it's a strategy that people kind of already know and kind of understand how it works, but it's actually broadly applicable. Game theorists have applied it to all sorts of things from, dividing up contested territory in international relations to helping couples who are getting divorced to business negotiations and bankruptcy courts. So it's like it's a strategy that gets used over and over and over again that initially feels like this weird childhood thing that you only ever do once, but it turns out it has all of these actually really good mathematical properties that allow it to be used in a huge variety of different contexts. It gets complicated when you have more than two people. That's when life starts to get hard. But actually, if you have two people, you can do it with almost anything, so long as the thing you have can be cut in various ways, can be divided into component parts.
How has the reception of the book been for you? Are you getting letters or responses from parents who have actually taken some of these theories and concepts and applications and explained to you, here's what we're doing?
Yeah, I've heard stories, so that's certainly true. I haven't gotten, thankfully, too many complaints from people who actually read the book. One of the funny things is as social media culture is what it is, it seems like the people who complain about it the most are not the people who read it. There are people that don't love the idea, like, oh, economics being applied to childhood, you're like ruining you're ruining people's childhood by, trying to optimize it or by trying to make them into little market-based agents or something, which we talk about in the book, and it's something that we're very sensitive to. But people who actually read the book seem to really enjoy it. For a lot of them, the strategies are familiar. Like I cut, you pick is a strategy they already know, and what the book is doing is it's generalizing them and showing them how a strategy that they knew, but they only had an idea of working in this very narrow range, actually is applicable to a much broader class of problems. So it tends to be people enjoy it. It's not one of those parenting books that's like, we're going to give you a philosophy of parenting that's going to solve every parenting problem. We're very upfront about that. Like, this is not what we're up to. Like, we're going to give you a collection of tricks that may or may not work. Different kids respond differently, and all problems are unique in a certain respect. And as a result, I think a few people were disappointed because they had this image that, like, if they just thought like a game theorist, like everything would be solved. And the title is a little tongue-in-cheek that's what's going to happen. But I mean, come on, parenting's hard. No one's going to solve it in one fell swoop.
You have done a lot of these sorts of interviews, and you did a series with Big Think on some of these ideas. Has the book afforded you some other opportunities to speak to a popular audience that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first off, it just opened a lot of doors right away. When the book first came out, I had a person who was in charge of publicity. She had this enormous Rolodex of people, and so I would go to her and say, hey, here's a op-ed that I think I could write, or here's an interview that I think I could do. And of course, not all of them happened, but some of them did. And so that opened a lot of doors right away. That was incredibly valuable. But also just the experience. I mean, what Paul and Amanda both taught me in terms of the ability to write meant that now writing those sorts of things is a lot easier. So both the book itself opened doors, but it also taught me a set of skills that I've been able to use in a lot of different ways. I wrote a lot of op-eds for a while, and have done, some podcasts and interviews and that sort of thing. So that's been really helpful. I mean, it's of course a skill that one still has to get better at, but yeah, it's been really valuable. And it's one of those things, like, once you're inside and once you understand how the world works, it's not as hard as it seems, but getting in the beginning is really hard. And so having somebody to hold your hand in the beginning was really, really helpful.
You have written for major publications: New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek. I could make a big list. What if there's a philosophy professor who is going, I haven't really tried that. I wouldn't know where to start. I love the things that I'm doing in terms of my research in academia, but I think I have some important things to say that other people in a more popular way could really benefit from. What advice do you give if someone comes up to you and goes, where do I start?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is you have to understand the norms of that world. So I wrote a blog post for the Daily News, which is like a philosophy blog about this particular thing. And the thing that I think was most shocking to me is newspapers are fast. Like, they are turning over things. They want op-eds tomorrow to run the next day, and so philosophers are used to very slow, very ponderous, like, okay, something just happened in the news. Let me think about what I want to say about it. Next month, I'll have gotten all my thoughts organized, and then I'll write the op-ed, and then 2 months later, I'll send it. But nope, news cycle's moved on. You missed your opportunity. So the first thing is, if you want to, especially if you're writing op-eds, you have to be, if the thing happened, you need to be sending that pitch that day. You need to be sending it right away. If a major news event happens on Friday, your pitch needs to be to them by Sunday. And that's just, philosophers are not ready for that. And then the other thing is, in terms of just like being interviewed or that sort of thing, is the same thing. Like, if a journalist writes you and says, hey, I saw that you work in this area, can I interview you for a story? Their deadline is tomorrow. Their deadline is the day after. So if you aren't sure, you hem and haw, or you say, yeah, I'm available, but next week, you've missed out. And so you have to respond fast. Everything is so fast. I think that's the thing that gets people the most in trouble. And then the other thing, which is the same thing that you say to somebody who's an academic, you're going to get rejected. Like, you're going to send the op-ed and it's not going to get published. I have a folder full of rejected op-eds that will never see the light of day because the moment's passed. And I think they were interesting, but somebody disagreed, and I have ones where I screwed up because I sent it to the New York Times first. They said no. And then by the time I got it to a different paper, they're like, too late. I liked it, but where was it 3 days ago? And so, you just have to kind of get that feel. But the story that I tell about the history of my book is, don't say no. Even if it feels like it's not quite the thing that you want to do, getting your foot in that door and getting experience is incredibly valuable. And I think the other thing that academics tend to do is we tend to see our own expertise very narrowly because we tend to think of ourselves in comparison to other academics. Like, I don't know as much about, political philosophy as somebody who specializes in political philosophy. But if I have a journalist come to me and say, I want to talk to you about political philosophy, they don't have time to find the best person. And so I need to, if I can say anything intelligent at all, say yes right away. Or just because I'm not the most qualified person to write an op-ed, maybe the most qualified person isn't writing an op-ed. So you are now the most qualified. And so I think that's the other thing, is we need to conceive of our expertise more broadly. I mean, of course, we're not experts on everything, but we know more than your average person about a huge swath of philosophy. And so be willing to expand that notion for the purposes of dealing with the popular audience, I think, is also really.
I think that's great advice. That's almost identical advice that I got from Tom Morris, who I spoke to in a previous episode. He said the same thing. So that's a couple people I respect and trust. Sounds like some good advice.
Yeah.
Maybe as my final question, you have achieved a lot. Your work, just anybody who will link to your CV and that sort of thing in the descriptions, but you've achieved a lot academically. You have written for popular audiences. You have a book out, etc. What are some of your philosophical goals at this point? What's on your list of things to accomplish, either in a category or projects that you're going to be working on?
So I'm finishing up an academic book now, specifically aimed at formal social epistemology, that area that I sort of think of the intersection of thinking about knowledge from a social perspective and also from a mathematical perspective. So I've been working on that for a long time. Thankfully, it's not a popular book, so it has a much longer time frame to work on. But that's near completion now. So I'm excited to get that book out. And I have a couple of other academic projects in mind. I think I'm going to start working on a book with a longtime collaborator of mine, Simon Hudiger, about the philosophical underpinnings of game theory, which I think is a really interesting topic, because game theory is this thing that gets used in a bunch of different fields, in computer science, in biology, in economics, in philosophy. And trying to think about what is the thing that unifies all of these very different uses of it is a topic that we're going to try and tackle in that book. So that book is a long ways away. Like, we've got an outline of chapters, and that's about it. But that's maybe the next thing that I think we're going to start working on. The bigger question that you're asking, like, once you're fancy pants professor of philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University, what do you do with your life? I mean, part of the reason I got into this gig was I just love it. I like doing it. These are problems that I like thinking about. And so for the most part, I think about problems in terms of what's fun for me. Like, what is the kind of thing where I want to think about it more. I want the excuse to think about it more. And so writing a paper or a book on it is the thing to do. And so that's really what drives me. I just think about what's fun for me, what's going to be interesting. And also, I mean, it has to be at least of interest to other people. I'm not going to literally only write a paper for myself, but it does afford me a certain degree of freedom that I get to work on a lot of different things, and I like that. I mean, I like learning a lot of different things. I like being involved in a lot of different academic fields, and so that's a big part of what drives what grabs.
Dr. Kevin Zollman, everyone, I know your time is limited. Thank you for spending so much of it with me. I could go another 2 hours, no problem, all kinds of questions, but I really appreciate the time. If people want to learn more, where's the best place to find you?
Best place to find me. I've got a website. I'm somewhat active on Blue Sky these days. I mean, I don't know. Social media changes so fast. God knows what'll be happening by the time I'm off of this. But if you find me on social media, I'll probably be posting there. I've also, I keep my website up to date, and they can find my work. Also, there's academic work out there. My popular book, The Game Theorist's Guide to Parenting, is out there, and also I've published in a bunch of different places.
Thanks again.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.